The sun had barely risen above the sandstone cliffs when the sound of hooves echoed across the dry valley. A cloud of dust rose behind a line of riders, cowboys, strangers to this land, their horses snorting steam into the cold desert air. The Apache village below stirred in silence. Women paused from grinding corn, children stopped mid-play, and the elders lifted their eyes toward the ridgeline where the riders appeared. No one had seen men like that before. Broad-shouldered, sunburned faces, hats shadowing eyes that seemed to carry both confidence and warning. The air grew tense as if even the wind dared not speak too loud. From the shaded huts, the Apache women whispered among themselves, their gazes fixed on the tall figure leading the cowboys. He rode like he belonged nowhere, and everywhere at once. His horse obeyed without the touch of reins, and when he dismounted, dust curled around his boots like the earth itself bowed to his steps. He didn't look at anyone directly, but his presence filled the clearing, pulling every gaze his way. The Apache women had seen traders, soldiers, and outlaws pass through before, but never a man like him. There was a quietness to his movements that unsettled them, an honesty that didn't need words. He carried no arrogance, no weapon in hand, only a steady calm that made even the guards lower their rifles without knowing why. The chief's daughter stood near the fire, her long dark braid resting over one shoulder. She watched him with narrowed eyes, trying to read the silence behind his face. Rumor had already reached her ears that these cowboys were searching for lost cattle, or so they claimed. But something deeper hid beneath their journey, something no one could name yet. The leader, that quiet man with eyes like a storm about to break, wasn't just passing through. He was here for something, or someone, and when his gaze briefly met hers across the smoke, she felt her heart stumble, unsure if it was fear or fate that made it do so. The cowboys came down to the edge of the village, careful not to cross into sacred ground. They spoke little, only exchanging glances as the chief approached. The leader nodded respectfully, removing his hat, showing a scar near his temple that told of some old fight he survived. The chief studied him for a long time before speaking through the translator, an older white man who had lived among the Apaches long enough to understand both languages. "What brings you to our valley?" the chief asked. The cowboy answered simply, "Cattle wandered south. We're not here to take anything that isn't ours." His tone was calm, but his eyes, those piercing sunlit eyes, said otherwise. The chief could sense he carried a story far heavier than stray cattle. As the talks continued, the women gathered quietly near the cooking fires, pretending to work but stealing glances at the strangers. Their laughter was soft but carried curiosity. They whispered about the tall cowboy's hands, rough from work but gentle when he touched his horse's neck. One of them, younger than the rest, said he looked like the kind of man who spoke to the wind before he slept. They giggled, teasing her, but even the elders noticed how the air around the men seemed charged, different, as if something unseen was unfolding. The chief's daughter stayed silent, though her eyes betrayed her thoughts. She could not understand why she felt drawn to this stranger who carried both peace and danger in his step. That evening, the cowboys set camp near the river. Smoke rose into the twilight, and the sound of harmonica drifted through the valley. The Apache children crept closer, their eyes wide with wonder. The music was unlike anything they had ever heard, soft, lonely, and full of something ancient. The leader sat by the fire, staring into the flames, lost in memory. He wasn't here for cattle. He was here because of a promise, one made years ago when the land was still soaked with blood from battles long forgotten. Somewhere beyond those mountains lay the truth he came to face. But fate had a strange way of testing a man before showing him what he sought. Later that night, while the stars stretched wide across the dark sky, the chief's daughter walked quietly to the river to fetch water. She stopped when she saw him standing there alone, his reflection trembling in the moonlit water. He turned slightly, his voice low but steady. "Did I scare your people today?" She hesitated, unsure whether to answer. "No," she said softly, "but they've never seen a man like you." He smiled faintly, eyes glinting under the moon. That's not always a good thing. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was heavier than words, carrying something that felt both dangerous and pure. The wind rustled the reeds, and she thought she heard the faint hum of his tune again, that same lonely melody. In the days that followed, the cowboys traded goods and repaired fences for food and shelter. But the longer they stayed, the more the air between the two worlds began to change. Some of the Apache men watched the cowboys with suspicion, but the women, especially the younger ones, could not look away. They admired the way the strangers worked, how they treated their horses, how they spoke to the elders with respect instead of pride. And among them, the chief's daughter found herself drawn again and again to the man whose name no one yet dared to ask. He didn't flirt, didn't boast, didn't even stay long in the same place, but his quiet nature spoke louder than any promise. Then one afternoon, everything changed. A group of armed traders rode into the village from the east, demanding horses and threatening the chief's men. Before anyone could move, one of them raised his rifle toward a child who had stepped too close. The cowboy was faster. In one breath he drew his revolver and fired, not to kill but to disarm. The bullet shattered the trader's weapon clean in half. The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye turned toward him. The Apache men saw courage. The women saw something else, honor. The chief's daughter saw destiny. That night, when peace returned, the chief invited the cowboy to sit beside him at the fire. He offered tobacco and asked, "You risked your life for a child not of your blood. Why?" The cowboy looked at the flames, his voice low. "Because no child should live in fear, not on this land." His words carried weight, echoing through the hearts of those who listened. The chief nodded slowly, understanding that this man was not like the others who came before. He was neither a conqueror nor a coward. He was something else, something the old stories spoke of but the people had forgotten. From that night on, the village spoke his name with quiet respect. The women still whispered, though now their laughter had softened into admiration. The chief's daughter began to appear near his camp more often, asking about his travels, his home, his scars. He answered simply, sometimes with a story, sometimes with silence. Yet beneath their conversations grew an understanding neither could explain. Two worlds were meeting, not with war or greed, but with something rare and fragile. As spring turned the valley green again, rumors spread beyond the hills that an army patrol was coming, hunting cowboys accused of trespassing on government land. The village grew restless. The chief warned that if soldiers found them here, there would be blood. The cowboy said he would leave before that happened. But that night when he came to say goodbye, the chief's daughter stopped him. "If you leave now," she whispered, her voice trembling, "they will think we feared you." "I don't." The wind howled between them, carrying her words into the dark. He looked at her, torn between duty and something deeper he didn't yet understand. He didn't know that this would not be the last time he saw her. The next dawn would bring gunfire, betrayal, and choices that would change both their lives forever. The man the Apache women once whispered about would soon become part of their story, their legend. And before the dust settled, before the soldiers came and the valley burned, she would look at him through tears and say the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I am now your wife." The dawn that followed was eerily still, the kind of quiet that makes a man think the world is holding its breath. The cowboy woke before the others, stirred by that uneasy silence. His horse stood tethered near the dying embers of the fire, head bowed low, as if sensing something unseen in the air. Across the valley, smoke curled from the Apache huts, soft and silver against the rising light. It should have been peaceful. But the calm felt wrong. Too fragile, too perfect. Like the hush before a storm that no one wanted to admit was coming. He rose, dusting off his coat, and walked toward the river where the chief's daughter often came to fetch water. He didn't expect her to be there so early, but she was, kneeling beside the stream, her reflection trembling in the ripples. She looked up when she heard his steps, her eyes catching the first light of the morning. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them had grown heavier since the night before, when she'd said those haunting words about being his wife. He didn't know if she had spoken from some tribal vow, or if it was something deeper, something neither of them could name. She filled her pot and stood, the wind carrying the faint scent of cedar smoke and wild sage. "You should leave before they come," she said quietly, not looking at him. "The soldiers won't listen to reason. They'll see you as one of us now." He wanted to argue, to say he didn't belong to anyone's side, but deep down he knew she was right. The moment he drew his gun for that child, he'd crossed an invisible line. "If I ride now," he said, "they'll follow me here. I won't lead trouble to your door." She turned then, her eyes sharp. "Trouble is already here. You just don't see it yet." He didn't know what she meant then, not fully. But later, as the sun climbed higher and the riders appeared from the west, he understood. Dust clouds rose beyond the ridge, 5, maybe 6 men riding hard. Not soldiers, not yet. These were scouts, the kind sent ahead to find out who was trespassing. They wore government coats and carried rifles that gleamed even from a distance. The chief saw them coming and called his men together. The cowboys stood ready, their hands near their weapons but their eyes unsure. The chief approached the cowboy, his face stern. "You said you came for cattle," he said. "But those men, they come for blood. What have you brought upon my people?" The cowboy shook his head. "They're not here for me alone," he said. "They're clearing land, forcing tribes off. My ranch burned for the same reason. I thought if I came south I could rebuild, maybe start again." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the weariness he'd been carrying for too long. The chief studied him for a moment and then said, "Then you know what it means to lose everything." That night the campfires burned lower, and tension hung thick over the valley. The Apache warriors kept watch, and the cowboys took turns standing guard by the horses. The chief's daughter sat near her father's fire, her thoughts heavy. She watched the cowboy as he fixed his saddle, his face lit by the glow of the flames. There was something in him she couldn't quite understand, some mix of sorrow and quiet defiance. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his words carried weight, like stones thrown into still water. She thought of what her grandmother had once said, "Sometimes the spirits send a stranger to change the wind." Maybe that was what he was, a wind that would either heal or destroy. As midnight deepened, she approached him again. "Do you believe in fate?" she asked softly. He looked up, surprised by the question. "I used to," he said after a moment. "Then the world taught me otherwise," she nodded slowly. "In our way, fate is not written. It's earned. You stand at a crossing now. If you go north, you might live. If you stay, you might die. But either way, your name will be remembered." He smiled faintly. "I'm not sure I want to be remembered." The night passed without gunfire, but no one slept easy. By dawn, the scouts had camped a few miles out, waiting for orders. The chief's men could see the glint of their rifles from the ridge. The cowboy knew what would come next. An army patrol, maybe 20 men, claiming to clear trespassers. He'd seen it happen before. Towns burned, families vanished, and land was divided like spoils of war. But this valley wasn't just land. It was sacred ground, the heart of a people who had buried generations under its soil. By midday, whispers ran through the village that some of the younger Apache men wanted to strike first, to ambush the scouts before reinforcements came. The chief refused. "A man who draws first blood invites his own death," he said. But the younger ones were restless. They saw the cowboy's gun, his calm, his strength, and mistook it for leadership. Some thought he could save them. Others thought he had brought ruin. The tension between both sides deepened, and even the women could feel it. They stopped laughing by the fires. The children stayed close to their mothers. The air grew heavy with fear, and every sound, the snapping of a twig, the cry of a coyote, felt like a warning. That evening, as the sun dipped low, the cowboy saddled his horse again. He looked toward the horizon, torn between leaving and staying. The chief's daughter appeared beside him, holding something in her hands, a small piece of turquoise tied with leather string. "Take this," she said. "It belongs to our family. My mother wore it when she crossed this valley as a bride. It will remind you where your heart belongs, even when the world forgets." He hesitated. "I can't take this from you." She met his eyes. "It's not a gift. It's a promise." He took it silently, tucking it into his coat pocket. For a moment, he thought he saw something in her gaze that felt like goodbye. But before he could speak, a shout came from the ridge. One of the cowboys ran down, breathless. "They're moving, boss. More riders coming through the canyon." The valley exploded into motion. Men grabbed rifles. Women pulled the children back into the huts, and the chief barked orders to his warriors. The cowboy mounted his horse, scanning the ridgeline. Dust rose again, and through it came the silhouettes of soldiers, blue coats glinting in the fading light. The scouts had done their work. The army was here. The chief's daughter clutched her father's arm. "We can't fight them all," she whispered. The old man nodded grimly. "Then we'll fight until the wind stops blowing." The cowboy rode forward, shouting for the cowboys to spread out. "Don't fire unless they do," he yelled. But the soldiers didn't wait. The first shot cracked through the air, echoing across the valley like thunder. Horses reared, women screamed, and chaos took hold. Smoke filled the air as both sides scrambled for cover. He saw one of his men fall. Another horse went down, kicking wildly. The chief's daughter ran toward the children, pulling them into a hut, her braid whipping in the wind. The cowboy turned his horse sharply and rode through the dust, firing warning shots, trying to drive the soldiers back without killing. He didn't want more blood on this land, but war had no patience for mercy. By the time the sun vanished behind the cliffs, the valley was filled with smoke and cries. When silence finally came, it wasn't peace, it was exhaustion. The soldiers had pulled back, leaving behind broken wagons and wounded pride. The cowboys were battered, the Apache scattered, and the chief's village half in ruin. The cowboy dismounted, stumbling toward the river. His hands trembled, not from fear but from the weight of what he'd seen. He dropped to his knees, his reflection staring back from the blood-tinted water. Behind him, the chief's daughter appeared, her face streaked with ash and tears. She knelt beside him without a word. For a long time they said nothing. Then she whispered, "The world will call this victory or defeat, but to me it is something else." He looked at her confused. "What?" She took his hand, placing it over her heart. "A beginning." He didn't understand it then, but in that moment, surrounded by ruin and the fading light of day, something shifted between them. Not love yet, something older, rawer, a bond forged by loss and the stubborn will to survive. When night fell again, he lay awake by the dying fire, staring up at the stars. Somewhere out there, the soldiers were regrouping. He knew they'd return, and when they did, he'd have to choose between the life he'd known and the one fate had handed him in this valley of strangers. As the fire burned low, he reached into his pocket and felt the piece of turquoise against his palm. It was still warm, as if her heart's heat lingered in it. He closed his hand around it and whispered into the darkness, "I'll stay till the end." But he didn't know what the end would look like. And when dawn came again, bringing new smoke on the horizon, the valley would never be the same. The smoke on the horizon the next morning didn't rise from cooking fires or morning prayers. It was darker, thicker, crawling through the valley like a warning from the heavens. The cowboy stood at the ridge with the chief, his hat low over his eyes, the turquoise charm heavy against his chest. Below them, the village still smoldered from the fight the night before. Broken fences, shattered clay pots, the wounded lying in the shade of the huts. No one had slept much. The night had carried whispers of horses moving in the distance. And now, as the sun crept up over the cliffs, those whispers took shape. Columns of soldiers advancing through the canyon, bringing with them the sound of drums, the glint of rifles, and the bitter promise of another battle. The chief said nothing for a long while. His face, carved by years of wind and sorrow, was unreadable. "They won't stop," the cowboy said quietly. "Not until they take this land." The old man nodded once. "Then we will make them pay for every step they take." His voice was steady, but the cowboy could hear the weariness in it. This wasn't the fight of a proud warrior. It was the fight of a father protecting what little remained. Down by the river, the chief's daughter tended to the wounded, her hands steady even as her heart trembled. The boy whose life the cowboy had saved was among them, his arm wrapped in cloth, his small face pale but alive. When she looked up and saw the cowboy returning from the ridge, something in her eyes shifted. "They're coming again," he said. She didn't flinch. "Then we'll meet them again." Around noon, the air began to hum with tension. The cowboys were fixing what was left of their camp, checking ammunition, tightening saddles, speaking in low voices. Some of them wanted to leave, arguing that this wasn't their fight. "We came here to find cattle," one of them muttered, "not to die for land that ain't ours." The cowboy didn't blame them. He knew they were right, but he also knew that walking away now would haunt them for the rest of their lives. "You ride off today," he said quietly, "and you'll tell yourself you had no choice. But deep down you'll know you left people to burn who didn't ask for this war." His words hung in the air. The men looked away, guilt heavy on their faces. Finally, one of them spat into the dust and said, "Then I guess we're staying." As the sun climbed higher, the valley began to change. The children were sent to hide in the caves north of the village. The women packed what food they could carry. The chief gathered his warriors in a circle, painting red lines across their faces, a mark of protection and remembrance. The cowboy stood among them, feeling out of place yet bound to them all the same. He had fought alongside many men in his life, but never like this. Never for something that felt so sacred, so alive. By afternoon, the first shots echoed through the canyon. The soldiers were closer now, methodical in their advance. Dust rose around their boots as they spread out along the dry creek bed. The cowboy could see the glint of their sabers from where he crouched behind a boulder. His horse snorted beside him, restless and afraid. He patted its neck. "Easy, boy. We'll see daylight again." The chief's daughter watched from the cliffs, her bow slung over her shoulder, her heart pounding like a drum. She wasn't supposed to be there, but she couldn't stay behind. She needed to see, to know. Through the smoke and dust, she spotted the cowboy leading a flank of riders toward the soldiers' left side. He moved like a shadow, quiet, focused as if every step he took was guided by something greater than himself. She couldn't explain it, but seeing him fight didn't fill her with fear. It filled her with faith. Then a gunshot cracked near her ear. A bullet struck the rock beside her, sending shards of stone across her cheek. She stumbled back, clutching the wound as warm blood trickled down her skin. Pain flared, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she notched an arrow and fired toward the smoke. The arrow vanished into the dust, followed by a distant grunt. She didn't wait to see if it struck true. She turned and ran down toward the village, her heart pounding. Meanwhile, the cowboy and his men fought from behind the rocks and trees, firing carefully, using every inch of the land to their advantage. The soldiers were disciplined, but the terrain wasn't theirs. Every step they took forward cost them lives. The chief's warriors moved like the wind, appearing, striking, vanishing. Yet for every man they brought down, 2 more came crawling over the ridge. The cowboy knew this couldn't last. The army had numbers, and eventually numbers would win. As night fell, the gunfire faded, leaving behind only the cries of the wounded and the crackle of fire. Both sides had pulled back to tend their losses. The soldiers were setting up camp near the mouth of the canyon. The chief gathered his people in the center of the village, speaking softly to them. The cowboy stood at the edge of the circle, listening. The chief's words were calm, but his eyes told another story. He knew this was only the beginning. Later, the cowboy found the chief's daughter near the river, washing the blood from her cheek. The moonlight made the water shine like glass. "You shouldn't have been out there," he said. She didn't look up. "I couldn't just watch." He knelt beside her. "You're brave," he said quietly. "Braver than most men I've known." She gave a small, tired smile. "Bravery isn't what I feel. It's fear that won't let me run." For a while they sat in silence, the sound of the river masking the pain of the world around them. Then she spoke again, her voice trembling. "When I was a child, I dreamed the land would one day be quiet again. No guns, no soldiers, just wind and horses. My mother said the earth remembers peace even when men forget." She turned to him then. "Do you think the earth remembers?" He looked at the stars reflected in the water. "I think the earth remembers everything," he said softly. "Even the promises we break." Before dawn, a new sound filled the air. Bugles, sharp and cold. The army was moving again. The cowboy rose, heart heavy. The chief's daughter watched him prepare his rifle. "You can still leave," she whispered. "Before it's too late," he shook his head. Too late was yesterday. By sunrise, smoke once again filled the valley. The soldiers had brought reinforcements, dozens more with wagons and artillery. The ground trembled as the cannons rolled into place. The chief's warriors scattered into the hills, ready to strike from above. The cowboy and his men took position along the riverbank, the last line between the soldiers and the heart of the village. The first cannon fired, the blast echoing like thunder across the cliffs. Earth and debris rained down. The cowboy ducked, coughing, shouting orders. The sky filled with smoke, and through it he saw something that froze his blood. Fire spreading from the huts, carried by the wind. The soldiers weren't just trying to win, they were trying to erase everything. The chief's daughter ran toward the flames, dragging buckets of water, shouting for help. The cowboy saw her and felt panic rise in his chest. He wanted to run to her, but the soldiers were closing in. Bullets whined past his head. He fired back, taking down a rider who tried to flank their line. The chaos was total. Shouts, smoke, horses screaming. Somewhere behind him, the chief fell. The sound of his body hitting the ground cut through the noise. The daughter screamed, running toward her father. The cowboy turned just in time to see her kneel beside the old man, her hands trembling. He wanted to go to them, but the world was a blur of fire and thunder. The battle didn't end that day. It only paused when both sides ran out of strength. By nightfall, the valley was burning on both ends. The army had pulled back again, but the damage was done. Half the village was ash. The chief lay dying, his daughter beside him. The cowboy knelt across from them, his heart heavy with guilt. The old man looked at him with fading eyes. "You have done what the spirits asked," he whispered. "You stood when others would flee." The cowboy shook his head. "I brought this here." The chief managed a weak smile. "No, you brought choice. The earth will remember." When the chief's breath finally stilled, the night seemed to grow colder. The daughter leaned against the cowboy's shoulder, silent tears tracing the dust on her face. The wind carried the smell of smoke and sorrow, but somewhere beneath it, there was still life, faint, stubborn, unbroken. The cowboy knew the soldiers would return with dawn, stronger than before. And he knew something else. He couldn't leave her now. The fight was no longer about cattle or land. It was about the promise of something worth dying for. In the distance, thunder rolled again, not from the sky, but from the march of boots and hooves returning through the canyon. He tightened his grip on his rifle, the turquoise charm pressing warm against his skin. Tomorrow would decide everything, but tonight, in the glow of dying fires and whispered prayers, the legend of the man the Apache women once stared at was still being written in blood and dust. The night that followed felt endless. The fire in the valley had burned down to embers, but its glow still licked the sky, painting the cliffs in shades of red and sorrow. Smoke drifted through the camp, curling into the stars like spirits refusing to rest. The cowboy sat near the dying fire with his rifle laid across his knees, eyes fixed on the horizon where the soldiers had disappeared hours before. He hadn't slept, nor had the chief's daughter. She sat beside her father's body, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and ash. The silence between them was heavy, too full of things neither dared to say. Far off, the coyotes began to howl. To anyone else it might have sounded like mourning, but to those who had lived long in the desert it was a sign, a call before dawn that the earth was not done with them yet. The cowboy listened, his jaw tight. He could feel the air changing again, colder now, charged with something waiting to break. When he rose to his feet, the chief's daughter followed, her face pale against the firelight. "They'll come with the sunrise," he said quietly. "More men, more guns." She didn't ask how he knew. She could hear the certainty in his voice. "Then we must be ready." They walked through the ruins together, stepping over broken pottery and scattered feathers, past the burnt edge of the village where the horses were tethered. The air smelled of smoke and blood, and yet there was something defiant about the way the survivors moved. Patching walls, gathering arrows, preparing as though their lives hadn't been torn apart. The old songs began to hum again in low voices, the kind sung before battle or death, no one sure which this would be. At the riverbank, the cowboy stopped. His horse lifted its head, sensing his unease. Across the water, faint lights flickered in the canyon, lanterns moving in lines. "They're setting up camp," he murmured. "Closer this time." He turned to her. "They'll attack at dawn." Her eyes glistened in the faint light. "Then we'll fight at dawn." He looked at her, trying to find the words that could stop her, but none came. There was too much fire in her heart, the same kind that had burned in her father's eyes. She wasn't a woman who waited for rescue. She was the one who stood beside you when the world came crashing down. Before heading back, she stopped and took something from her wrist. A thin strip of red cloth faded from time. She tied it around his arm, her fingers trembling slightly. "My people wear this when they stand for something they believe in," she said softly. "Now it belongs to you." He looked down at it, then at her, his voice barely a whisper. "What if I fall?" She met his gaze steadily. "Then the wind will remember." The first light of dawn bled over the cliffs, a cold gray glow spreading across the land. The valley was quiet, almost too quiet. The cowboy moved among the men, checking rifles, counting ammunition. The Apache warriors hid in the high rocks, their faces painted for war, their eyes sharp and silent. He could see the fear in some of the cowboys' eyes, but also something else. Resolve. They'd come too far to run now. By the time the sun broke free from the horizon, the first cannon thundered. The sound rolled through the valley like the roar of the earth itself. The ground shook, birds scattered from the cliffs, and the men braced themselves as fire and dust filled the air. The cowboy shouted for his riders to spread out, but the next blast sent one of them flying from his horse. The soldiers were closer this time, their formation tight, rifles gleaming. The cowboy ducked behind a boulder, loading his gun, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. Bullets tore through the sagebrush around him. He returned fire, striking a soldier in the shoulder. All around him, chaos reigned, horses screaming, men shouting, smoke turning day into night. Yet amid it all he could see her, the chief's daughter, moving between the huts with the wounded, her face streaked with dirt and determination. A shell exploded near the river, sending a spray of mud and fire into the air. The cowboy's ears rang, his vision swimming. He stumbled to his feet, blood trickling down his temple. He looked toward the village and saw what made his heart freeze. 3 soldiers on horseback breaking from formation heading straight for her. Without thinking, he ran. His boots pounded the dirt, his gun in hand, every breath sharp and heavy. He fired once, missed. The riders were too fast. The second shot struck true, dropping one horse. The other 2 kept coming. She turned just as one of the soldiers swung down, grabbing her arm. She struggled, striking at him, but he was stronger, dragging her toward the horses. The cowboy reached them in time to slam into the soldier, knocking him into the dust. They wrestled in the dirt, fists and fury colliding. The soldier drew his knife, slashing, but the cowboy caught his wrist and drove his elbow into his jaw. The blade fell, and with one final blow, the fight was over. He turned just in time to see the last rider raising his rifle toward her. The shot cracked, echoing across the valley. The cowboy spun, pulling her down with him. The bullet tore through the air above their heads, splintering a wooden beam. For a moment, everything froze. The smoke, the screams, the world itself holding still. Then he looked up, saw her face inches from his, her breath quick and shallow. "You're hurt," she whispered. He shook his head. Not yet. They rose together, but the battle was shifting fast. The soldiers were advancing, pressing toward the heart of the village. The Apache warriors were being pushed back toward the hills, their numbers thinning. The cowboy saw one of his men fall beside the fire pit. Another crawled toward cover, bleeding badly. The situation was turning hopeless. He grabbed her hand. "We can't stay here," she hesitated. "The wounded." "We can't help them if we're dead," he said firmly. She looked into his eyes, saw the truth and nodded. Together they ran toward the ridge, keeping low through the smoke. The ground trembled again as another cannon fired, the blast sending heat rolling over their backs. When they reached the top of the ridge, the cowboy turned to look down at the valley below. It was a vision of ruin, flames licking through the huts, men fighting in shadows, the river running dark. His jaw clenched. "They'll burn everything," he said quietly. "Everything you ever knew." She looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Not if you stop them." Her words hit like a spark to dry wood. He remembered the promise he'd made the night before, to stay until the end. Maybe this was that end. Maybe it had always been leading here. He turned to the men who had followed him up the ridge, tired, blood-stained, but still standing. "If we fall back now," he said, "there'll be nothing left. We fight here, not for cattle, not for land, for them." The men nodded, no one speaking. The chief's daughter raised her bow, the wind catching her hair. The sun broke through the smoke for a brief golden instant, and in that moment, the valley seemed to hold its breath again. Then the cowboy gave the signal. They charged down the ridge like thunder, horses kicking up clouds of dust. The soldiers turned too late. The first volley of gunfire struck their flank, scattering them in confusion. The Apaches rose from the rocks, arrows flying through the smoke. The clash that followed was unlike anything the valley had ever seen, a storm of sound and fury, men crying out in rage and desperation. The cowboy fought like a man possessed. Every shot, every movement felt guided by something beyond him, fate perhaps, or the memory of the people who had fallen. Around him his riders shouted, their voices hoarse, their hearts blazing. But even as the tide turned for a moment, he saw the next wave of soldiers cresting the canyon. Reinforcements, too many. The sound of their drums echoed through the dust, steady and merciless. He reloaded, his hands shaking. "It's not over," he muttered. The chief's daughter stood beside him, her arrows gone, her face streaked with blood and smoke. "Then we don't stop," she said. Her voice trembled but didn't break. The last of the sunlight faded behind the cliffs. The valley was a sea of shadows and fire, the sound of gunfire like the beating of the earth's heart. The cowboy looked out over it all, at the ruins, at the faces still fighting, at the woman beside him, and knew the next hour would decide everything. He took one last breath of the desert air, the scent of smoke and sage heavy in his lungs. Somewhere in that chaos, he thought he could hear the old chief's voice again, whispering that the earth remembers. Maybe it did. Maybe this was how it remembered, with fire, with courage, with blood spilled for something worth saving. He tightened his grip on the rifle, the red cloth fluttering on his arm, the turquoise charm pressing against his chest like a heartbeat. The world roared around him, and he stepped forward into the smoke, ready to meet whatever waited beyond it. The soldiers' drums grew louder. The ground shook. The final charge was coming, and in that moment, between the firelight and the dust, between life and death, the cowboy's fate and hers hung in the balance. The world had turned gray after the last gunfire faded. Smoke drifted lazily through the shattered valley, carrying the scent of gunpowder and dust. The cowboy stood in the middle of what was left, his rifle hanging loose in his hand, his chest rising and falling with slow, heavy breaths. The sky had opened again, no longer filled with ash but with a cold, pale light that made the broken land look ghostly. He couldn't tell if he had won or simply survived. Around him, the cries of the wounded mixed with the rustle of wind through burned grass. The soldiers had retreated at last, leaving their dead scattered among the rocks. The price of their victory, if that's what it could be called, was too high for anyone to celebrate. He turned toward the hill where she stood, the chief's daughter, her braid undone, her dress streaked with ash, her eyes wide with disbelief at the sight before her. When their gazes met, something unspoken passed between them, the kind of silence that carries both grief and gratitude. She walked slowly toward him, her steps unsteady but sure. He dropped his rifle and met her halfway, his hands trembling as he reached for her arm. "It's over," he said, though the words felt hollow. "For now," she whispered. Her eyes shifted toward the horizon where the soldiers had vanished. "They'll be back someday. Maybe not soon, but this land never stays quiet for long." He nodded, unable to argue. They both knew the truth of it. The valley had seen too much blood to ever forget. Still, for the first time in days, he could hear the birds again. The faint flutter of wings above the ruins, a sound fragile but alive. Maybe that was enough for now. The people gathered their strength in the following days. They buried their fallen in silence, each grave marked with stones and feathers. The cowboy helped where he could, digging, mending, standing guard at night while the others slept. His men, those who had survived, stayed with him until the work was done. When the last of the fires burned out and the graves were covered, the cowboys began to pack their things. "We'll head west," one of them said. "Try for new land, maybe start again." The cowboy only nodded. He didn't say whether he would follow. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, he sat by the river. The turquoise charm she had given him was still tied around his neck. The red cloth faded on his arm. He turned the charm over in his hand, watching the way it caught the last light. Every time he looked at it, he remembered her father's voice, her bravery, the way she had stood tall when everything else had fallen apart. She found him there as the stars came out. "The people will move north," she said quietly. "To safer ground. There's food there and water." He looked up. "And you?" She hesitated. "I'll go with them. My father's spirit belongs to this valley, but the living must keep walking." She sat beside him, the sound of the river soft between them. "What about you? Where will you go?" He didn't answer right away. His life had been made of movement, always one place to another, never staying long enough to call anywhere home. But now, for the first time, the thought of leaving made him feel hollow. "I don't know," he said finally. "The world's wide, but it doesn't feel big anymore." She smiled faintly, her voice barely above the wind. "Maybe because you've already found what you were looking for." They sat in silence for a long while, watching the stars. It was strange how the same sky could hang over both ruin and hope. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small clay jar filled with river water. "This is from the place my father was born," she said. "He told me once that the river remembers everyone who drinks from it. When you leave, take it with you. So the water will know your story too." He took it gently, his fingers brushing hers. "I'll keep it safe," he promised. In the days that followed, the people began their journey north. The cowboy helped load the wagons, guided the horses through the rocky trails, and made sure no one was left behind. The chief's daughter walked at the front, her chin lifted, leading her people like her father once had. The bond between them, between her tribe and the stranger who had fought beside them, had become something no soldier or law could undo. When they reached the ridge that overlooked the valley one last time, she stopped. Below them lay the land that had taken so much and given just enough back to keep them standing. "He would have wanted you to see it this way," she said, her voice steady. "Alive even after the storm." He nodded, unable to speak. That night, by the fire, the men sang low songs in their language. The words unfamiliar but the meaning clear. Remembrance. Gratitude, the fragile peace that comes after survival. When morning came, he saddled his horse. The time had come to go. She approached him quietly, her eyes calm. "Wherever you ride next," she said, "don't forget this valley." He smiled faintly. "I couldn't if I tried." He started to turn his horse, but she reached out and took his hand. "You could stay," she said softly. For a moment he wanted to say yes. The thought of leaving her behind tore something deep inside him, but he knew her path was not his. "If I stay," he said, "I'll bring trouble again. The world doesn't leave men like me alone for long." She looked down, then back up at him. "Then go where the wind takes you. But don't ride with regret." He leaned down, his voice low. "The river remembers," he said, echoing her words. "And so will I." She smiled through her tears. Then we're even. He rode out at dawn, his shadow long across the sand. Behind him the valley shimmered in the golden light, and for the first time he didn't feel like a wanderer. He felt like a man who had left something of himself behind, something good, something worth remembering. Seasons passed. The soldiers never returned. The land healed slowly. Grass grew where fire had scorched the ground, and the river flowed clear again. The people built new homes farther north, and stories of the battle became legend. Around the fires, the elders spoke of the stranger who came from the west, a cowboy who fought not for gold or land, but for honor, who stood beside the tribe when others turned away. Some said he rode into the mountains and vanished. Others swore they saw him years later, working a small ranch near the border, a turquoise charm around his neck and a red cloth still tied around his arm. The chief's daughter grew into her father's place as a leader. She carried his wisdom and her own quiet strength, guiding her people through drought and peace. Sometimes, when the wind swept across the plains, she thought she could hear the faint sound of hooves in the distance, and she'd smile, knowing some stories never really end. They just ride farther than the eye can see. And when she walked by the river at dusk, she often whispered to the water, letting her voice blend with its song. The river, true to its nature, carried those whispers far beyond the valley, to wherever he was, wherever he would go. The land that had once been soaked with fear now breathed with life again. Wildflowers returned to the slopes, and the wind that once carried the smoke of war now brought only the scent of rain. The earth, just as the old chief had said, remembered everything, every loss, every promise, every act of courage. The cowboy's story lived on not in books or monuments, but in the hearts of those who had seen him ride through the fire and stand beside them when the world turned against them. In time, mothers told their children, there was a man once, and the Apache women could not stop staring, not because he was strange, but because they saw something in him, something true. And somewhere far away, under another sky, that man sat by a quiet river of his own, the turquoise charm glinting faintly in the light. He took a sip of water from the clay jar she'd given him, closed his eyes and smiled. The world was still wide, the road still open, but in his heart, he was no longer a drifter. He was part of the land now, part of the memory that would never fade. The wind moved softly through the canyon, carrying whispers across the hills, echoes of love, loss, and the kind of peace only found when a man finally understands where he belongs. And in that quiet moment, the story ended the only way it could, with the world remembering.